Hello, everyone. Welcome back to One Plus One. This is part four and our final part of looking at a history of China, but through a post-colonial Marxist perspective. And here to be our history teacher is Pat Byrne, longtime Anglo-Irish trade unionist. Pat, welcome back to One Plus One. And yes, and so Pat, so in our final part about China, now I'm there's a lot to talk about China's foreign policy, but we're going to have to save that for another time. One
Sure.
question I want to have as as we end, this four-part presentation about China. You were talking about why China is not some capitalist economy the way the Philippines and Indonesia is, which is mostly being a neo-colony to the Anglo-American, Canadian, and Pan-European empires. You've
Mhm.
shown us how no, China really does not operate like the free market of those ones. So, so I have to ask. So I have to ask this question, which is, explain again how China's economy does not work like a free market economy, the way the way South Korea operates, and the way Japan operates. And after you're done explaining that, this is going to be a great segue into how the population is educated in their mentality. So first start off with that.
Okay. Well, you made the comparison with, for example, South Korea and Japan and so on. And I think if you look at, it's interesting to look at them. Take South Korea as a classic example. South Korea after the Korean War, which ended in a kind of a stalemate, and they divided the country. But basically, the Americans had sought to help their puppet to take control of the whole of Korea, but they failed. So the country was split in half. And then for quite a few years, South Korea was a very poor society, but kind of existed on charity from America. America maintained South Korea because for geopolitical reasons in its rivalry with the Soviet Union. And they kept funding South Korea, but the South Korean economy was in a mess. And then towards the end of the decade, 1950, 1960, there was a coup. And I can't remember his name, the general who took over. What he did was he arrested and put in jail for about 18 months all the top capitalists in South Korea. They were in these family businesses, right? Chaebols, they call them. And he basically only let them out when they agreed to follow the directions of the government and cooperate with the state and with each other. And what they did was they basically said, you have to choose, because they were holding companies that did lots of different activities, that you have to choose a particular sector and then stick to that, and then we're going to work with you to build you up. So one would choose electronics, one would choose shipbuilding, one would choose auto manufacture, etc., agriculture and so on.
Right
And
wing
so
engaging in
yeah, so you had
engaging in planned economy.
yeah, so it was in many ways a kind of planned economy where the state enforced the capitalists to do what they had to do, and it was incredibly successful. Now, why did it's come to an end now? South Korea is now in a process, in a period of economic stagnation. And why that happened was that as time went on, these capitalists, it was very successful. They had massive growth. These capitalists got richer and richer. And eventually, at the same time, neoliberalism became a key force in the West and started to spread over to South Korea. So by the time of the mid 80s into the 90s, the capitalists they didn't like the system, the top capitalists, because they were having to do the orders of the government. But they became powerful enough, and with a neoliberal ideology at their back, which said that government should interfere in the economy, they're able to bring this developmental policy, which is what it was called, they were able to bring it to an end. The same with Japan, the same with Taiwan. And so they've gone into a neoliberal era, and of course, with all the problems of neoliberalism, they slowly, growth goes down to a point where they stagnate. Now, in China, you can say that the Chinese have learned from this, but the difference is that, number one, the capitalists can never, become strong enough. I mean, there's always a danger that if China allowed the capitalist class to, the private sector to become bigger and bigger and bigger, and then there could come a danger where they could undermine their own system. And this explains why the fact that Chinese don't want to do this explains why the Chinese have been cracking down on the big companies, the big tech industries and so on. Most people are familiar with the story of Alibaba, and Jack Ma, the richest man in China, and he made two mistakes. One, he made a speech at a financial conference at which a lot of party bureaucrats were there from that sector, from the central bank and all that, in which he criticized very openly and brutally in a very cavalier way, the way that the banking system worked in China. So that pissed them off. But not only that, he did it on the eve of him launching a new IPO, Ant Financial IPO, which was going to be the biggest initial public offering in the world, where you go out on the stock market and you appeal to people to invest in your new company. And it was all about supplying on the phone, making it very easy for people to get credit, get loans on the phone. And so he pissed off the officials, and they realized what he was trying to do was to replicate, using new technology, the financialization process that was destroying the Western economies, the neoliberal thing. So of course they stopped the IPO. Jack Ma disappeared for about 3 months. He was discovered. He used to be a teacher when he was younger. He was discovered teaching some young kids in the school. And from that point onwards, we don't hear anything from Jack Ma anymore. And they've done the same. They've done the same, to one degree or another, with a number of these leaders. And this is a very interesting development. China has realized, and at some point, in my view, there will come a point where China can go beyond the capitalist private sector, especially if they develop a better form of the public sector. And that's another discussion. But what they've done is they've realized that having control of the private sector in the way they do, they can maximize the benefits of capitalism, the positive things of capitalism, and prevent the negative things. Now, how long they can do this for, we don't know. But that's what they've done, for example. So they know that that capitalism can be very dynamic and in its competition. And so, for example, it's good to take an example. If you take electric cars, there are something like 100, maybe even 150, but 100 electric car companies in China. Now, only a certain percentage of them, probably maybe only the top 10, are going to survive, and all the others are going to close down. And the point's been made that this is a waste of resources, and there's some truth to that. But I came across a shocking statistic recently, which I had never known about, that in the 1920s, you know that in America that you had Henry Ford, that lover of Hitler. He was a big admirer of Hitler. And Hitler regarded him as his good friend and all that bollocks. Yeah. Anyway, he had this incredible success with the Model T car. and the introduction of mass production to produce it. And it'd been very successful because it was cheap. And it got people from A to B, but it was pretty ropey. I mean, it was not very comfortable and difficult to get going and all. But within a few years, 2,000 companies emerged in America. 2,000 private companies emerged in America in the 20s, car companies. And because of that huge competition, cutthroat competition, America went from the very basic Model T to these incredible, you see them in these old Hollywood movies, these incredible cars with all this modern, you know, plush, fantastic designs, beautiful, comfortable technologies, the windscreen wipers, whatever it was that they.
And thanks to Ralph Nader, better protection.
Well, no, but Ralph Nader's obviously later, but I know what you mean. But the thing was, it meant that for 2 generations, America completely dominated world auto production, completely, and not just cars, but trucks and vans and you name it, right? And that was huge benefit for American industry. China is doing the same thing. China is, and of course, the other interesting thing, China's competition is not quite the Western style competition. It's integrated with the state so that local governments are in charge of the local companies in one way or another. They dominate these companies because they provide the logistics and the land and subsidies and to provide local employment for their local areas. So each provincial government is pushing their local EV company. So you've got a mixture of the state and private enterprise, even in the competition process. So as a result, China is taking by storm the world auto manufacturing sector, right? And so they've realized that they're doing this in one sector after another. They're trying to get the best part of capitalist, the dynamism of capitalist competition, but have control of it so it doesn't get out of hand. They're not allowing monopolization to develop, for example. And they're also at the same time trying to look after the workers' interests. So, for example, you know, gig working in the West, you know, where delivery driving and all that sort of thing.
A lot of it on 0-hour contracts.
Right.
Awful, right. Terribly exploited.
So this was developing in China as well, you know, even more so because China, you know, you know, people in China are very open to technology. And so, you know, they are willing to order everything online, and it comes within 2 or 3 hours in a lot of cities. So it's even more efficient than it is in the West. You don't have to wait a day. You don't have to get it the next day. You get it by 12 o'clock and things like that. And of course, it got even more accelerated during COVID, didn't it? So the Chinese order everything online almost, right? Now, so you can imagine how many delivery drivers there are. And they were suffering the same problem as the delivery drivers here in Brazil or in America, the same. Now, what happened? A junior minister in the Chinese government, he got his friend, who's a delivery driver, to arrange for him to go out to register with one of these companies as a delivery driver. They didn't know who he was. And they filmed the whole process. And he filmed what happened to him during the course of the day and how bad it was. And how that company were setting targets that were too difficult to achieve in terms of the traffic and so on. And they were fining him. So half of his income for the day was lost in fines by the company saying that he didn't deliver in time. You know, this kind of crap, right?
Yeah.
So the video that was produced, I've seen it, it's hilarious. It went viral and it was used as the basis to all of the companies, all the delivery companies had to apologize publicly. They had to agree that they would not do these fines anymore. They had to agree that all the workers could join the unions, that they would raise their wages, and they would shorten their hours. And then it went from there. Then the Chinese Communist Party came out, the government came out with a state with a kind of what would you call it now, like I don't know what you call it, but anyway, it was a list of things.
Yeah.
that all the top tech billionaires had to sign and come on television and promote, which were things like, it started off with, the first priority of our company is our staff. Not profits, not the product, not the customers, our staff. They had to agree to have trade union, because in the tech sector, there was this thing called 996. Have you ever heard of that? Okay, this is where workers were having to work from 9 in the morning till 9 at night, 6 days a week.
Yeah.
In all Alibaba and Tencent, JD, etc. Anyway, so they've cut right across all that, so that they have to agree to all kind of conditions. Health and safety has to be a very big part of the company, etc., etc., etc. And so it's like a charter for workers' charter, right?
And that, my friends, is Chinese is socialism with Chinese characteristics in action.
Exactly.
That's simply unheard of if you even do minor if you do even minor analysis of Japan and its capitalism. That's just unheard of. But that's,
I know. And there was another aspect to that, just important as well, because the Chinese know that there's an inherent tendency in capitalism towards monopoly. You start off with 100 companies, and a few companies get ahead, and then they get all the advantages of large scale ordering and production and so on. So they make more profits. They're able to reduce the prices. They outcompete all the other companies. And then they use also their political influence and their money to get politicians to do decisions for them. And so you end up with, like in America now, if you go in every sector in America, you will find that a maximum of 4 companies dominate the whole sector, like 90% of the sector. Often it's sometimes 3, even down to 2. And they know that leads to suppression of technology. I mean, we can see this with Google, with Facebook, how they buy up all their all these startups who come up with new ideas. They buy them up. Sometimes they use them, but a lot of the time they just close them down because it will hit their bottom line.
Which is why I think people, even if Google or Facebook or X, formerly Twitter, dabbles you with a lot of money to buy your company, I would say to people, keep at it.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Don't sell yourself.
But so in China, they know this is a big danger in capitalism. So what they do is they're intervening. So they cut Alibaba down to size. Alibaba was doing all this online ordering, and it was the largest online ordering after Amazon. They cut it down to size because they were finding that the small manufacturers and sellers on the platform were all complaining about how Alibaba was stealing their profits and doing. Amazon does a lot of this stuff. Where they basically sell a product online, and if it's very successful, they steal it from you effectively. Do all sorts of maneuvers. So they realized that this was happening in China, and so they cut them right down to size and broke them up and a lot. And they're doing the same. Any manufacturer or these new technology companies, they're stopping their monopolization of the system, And in fact, it's funny, I've seen interviews with startup people in associations representing startups in China who are very happy with what the Chinese state is doing, because it's helping the startups who are being suppressed by these big companies. But of course, in the West, they're all saying this is a bad policy of China, right?
Yes, yes, because China's cracked down on.
And then they say when China arrests bankers, put them in prison, they get very surprised in the West when all of their viewers say, we want that here. Why didn't they arrest the bankers during the banking crisis?
But then I have to ask this question. Now, I remember when we were talking on WhatsApp privately about the Chinese system, the USSR, and
right.
So I have to ask. So I have to ask this question, which is, well, actually, Well, before I ask the question I wanted to ask, do explain how the Chinese system works when it comes to education and that story of how of how when people graduate they have to read the Little Red Book of Mao. So yeah, so talk to us about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the funniest things that you got these people on the left in the West who, and I want to come on to a few criticisms about China because, China is not heaven, and
Yeah,
the leadership don't say they say they welcome criticism as long as it's constructive. But a lot of people in the West, they don't understand how China operates, and they believe they're unfortunately too heavily influenced by all the bourgeois media around them.
yeah,
And it's a campaign. There's this war of propaganda against China that started in 2017, when, or 2016, 17, but 2017, when Trump launched his trade war against China. By coincidence, then suddenly every day we get anti-China stories. I wonder why,
yeah.
Anyway, so so the people in the West, they don't understand how these things work, and they take the view, which is that. Sorry, let's go back to that question you asked. I've lost my thread there. What was the question you asked again?
Explain how
Education.
yeah, and
All
how
right,
when you
sorry.
enter
Yeah,
universities and even
sure.
when you leave universities,
Right.
start your business, how
All right. Well, this is why I said about the left in the West. And they have this idea that China is a capitalist society, right? Sometimes they call it state capitalist, or they
exactly.
don't, whatever they use, dictatorial capitalist, autocratic capitalist, all kind of phrases they use. But the question you have to ask is, I mean, apart from the fact that you've got 5-year planning, and that you've got the banks are state-owned, and you've got 32,000 state-owned enterprises, and you've got nearly 50% of investment is state investment, which is like more than twice it is of any of the capitalist countries, and many things like that, examples of this. And you've got Communist Party in charge, which professes Marxism and Leninism, and you've got a constitution which starts its first words are that the proletariat are the leading force of the nation, and it declares it's a socialist country and all the rest of it. But when you look at the life of people, when a child goes to school, primary school, right, or nursery, primary school, they join the Red Pioneers, or whatever they call them, right?
Yeah,
Which they've got like about 50 million of them, and they learn revolutionary songs, and they march around with red neckerchiefs. And then they go to the secondary school and they join another youth organization, the Young Communist League, or whatever it's called, which has got huge millions and millions of subscribers. And they have to learn Marxism, Leninism. And even when they go to university, they have to study Marxism, Leninism courses there, right? Now, there is a fact that obviously there's going to be when you have to learn things, you know how young people are. And it's a consensus of society. You're going to might find it boring and whatever. But the fact that these things are all going on and that they have, they've got 300 million trade unionists in the Trade Union Federation, and they've got a huge youth movement, huge women's movements, and they're going around the world putting forward anti-imperialist slogans and documents and so on. Somehow or other, some of these people on the left think it's all theater and it's all fake, right?
yes,
but I have to,
yes,
but I have to ask the question: if you're a capitalist, why on earth would you? If you're a capitalist society, why on earth would you waste so much time and energy and all the rest of it saying that you're socialist and you're trying to achieve communism and you belong? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And not only that, you campaign for policies which are the direct opposite to imperialism. I mean, why would you do that? You hold conferences all over the world Who in their right mind? It's an Alice in Wonderland position, right?
Exactly, but
So,
then, but that's very interesting in and of itself, which has the reason. This kind of goes back to another question, which is, has the reason China has been able to overcome many attempts at a color revolution, and Tiananmen Square was an attempt to do the kind of color revolution that we just saw dissolve the Soviet Union and all of the Eastern Bloc,
right.
communist socialists. Uh, that's just not been able to gain a foot in China. There's the cult Falun Gong that the West has always been trying to prop up in China,
Yeah.
and it fails spectacularly. And Liu Xiaobo, who is seen as this wonderful Western liberal Democrat, who became martyred after he won the Nobel Prize. But if you look into what Liu Xiaobo believes in, it's pretty reactionary stuff. I mean, the guy would like China to be more corporatist. He supporter of the Vietnam War, supporter of the Western side of the Korean War, and yes, and has pretty rotten views. Like, was a supporter of the Iraq War, was supporter of the West's invasion of Afghanistan. So, so so how how is it that China has been able to overcome these color
Right.
revolutions? As does it really go back to the fact that they've learned from previous mistakes? They do small reforms, and if those small reforms are satisfactory, then they'll make bigger reforms, and just that the Chinese themselves, are they just much more smarter at knowing when the color revolution is about to happen, like in Hong Kong or Xinjiang. I'm curious your thoughts.
I mean, I think the most basic reason is that people don't overthrow their system if it's delivering benefits to them. You know, if their life is getting better, then why would they, risk everything and go on the street and whatever to overthrow a government? It's a truism in all over the world, right? And the Chinese, under the reform and opening up period, which we're still in that period. Although you could argue we're now, there's sort of sub thing because of the conflict with the West. But things have got so much better for people in terms of even the size of their housing, their living standard, and they see society progressing all around them. I mean, I saw, I can't remember the statistic now, but the number of museums that have been built across China in the last 10 years, it's like more museums than the rest of the world. It's something crazy. I mean, it's just absolutely amazing. And these are good museums and interesting. And people are going on holiday. I mean, who is it now? I think it's John Ross makes the point, the Professor John Ross. And he makes the point where he said, look, unlike the Soviet Union, where tourism was highly controlled, you could only travel around the Soviet Union if you were part of a collective tourist group. But so now I think like 150 million Chinese traveling abroad, they all come back. There's none of those. You remember that in the old Soviet days, the Cold War, there were all these defections of ballerinas and sportsmen. But it doesn't happen. The Chinese are happy with their society, relatively speaking. I'm sure they moan about lots of different things, but they see their society moving forward. Of course, it has problems. You like COVID, like everybody else. You get some problems that arise, but they generally are happy. So that's the underlying thing.
Yeah.
On top of that, the Chinese government, I think I have to say that I think that not only the Chinese government, but Putin and so on, they were all a bit slow in seeing what was happening. But they've all cottoned on to the realization of what all this, as you call them, color revolutions and regime change operations and grassroots protest movements and so on. I don't know if you follow this guy Sharp. What's his first name? Graham Sharp, is it? The guy who's died now, who was the father of all these originally supposed to be non-violent civil resistance movements.
Yes,
You know,
yeah.
That were used to great effect in the latter part of the overthrow of the Soviet bloc and so on. They've cottoned on to all this, and they know they don't allow the NGOs that are funded by the National Endowment for Democracy and all the rest of it, right? I mean, my attitude to all those so-called NGOs that are funded by abroad. So
semi-NGOs.
I don't
called semi-NGOs.
Yeah, well, yeah, semi-governmental organizations, you should call them too. But I don't believe any community organization should be allowed to be funded from outside the country. They should get their funding from the grassroots members of their organization, and not from any donations from rich people or from abroad and so on. Because how is that democratic? It's totally undemocratic, you know? So I think there should be a big move. I think there should be a big campaign all over the world for governments to close down these NGOs, or to make a condition that they only operate on funding from within their membership, because that's what real democracy is. And they can't be called a grassroots organization if they're funded from abroad and whatever, you know. So I think that's an important. I think there needs to be even a higher level of understanding about this, and a big campaign to close down all these organizations, because it's the opposite of democracy. So I think that there is this awareness. I mean, one of the interesting things people don't. I listened to someone talking the other day. It was Novara Media. You know Novara Media?
Yeah.
So I was listening to an interesting interview by Aaron Bastani of a Chinese woman who has written a book from SOAS in London. And he blithely mentioned, which I don't think, because no discredit to him, but he's very open about the fact that he doesn't know that much about China. And he just blithely said, well, civil society doesn't exist in China. But he doesn't know what he's talking about. There's over 1 million organizations now in China that are community organizations or whatever, that are not controlled by the party. They're nothing to do with the party, who are doing all kinds of services for the blind people and all kinds of other things, education and stuff like that. And you've got the semi-official organizations like 300 million trade unionists. You've got the women's organizations, youth organizations. So there's a lot of civil society, and people don't understand in China. It's not this dystopian prison house that people think it is. You know, I mean, if you disagree with the economic policy of the government in some aspect, you're free to say what you think about it, right? And there's a huge debate going on in the academic community, online, about policies for the future of China. As long as they're constructive and positive, the party leadership's got nothing to worry about them. But of course, if you're trying to plot to overthrow the Communist Party and whatever, then of course you're not going to get a good reception. And there's a number of left organizations who go into China and try to create these independent trade unions and Marxist societies that are based around overthrowing the Communist Party. And they saw the disastrous result in the Soviet Union when the Communist Party was made illegal in 1991. We saw what happened: the terrible devastation of people's living standards, even cannibalism breaking out, and the disaster of the 90s. How people's lives were destroyed, you know, and old people.
I always love that expression that our friend Boyan of the Barricade uses, like a civilizational downgrade. That's literally what happened.
Exactly.
That's clearly what happened to Russia.
And
they're still dealing with it. They're still dealing with it.
So my attitude towards China and all these questions is one of critical support. So support for Chinese society and all the great things they're achieving, but being willing to criticize, but in a positive way. So, for example, on the housing thing, I think, and China's trying to do that now, I think we need a big move to develop public housing in China. And what we also need, we need public house building companies to be developed by the state. And we could then take that technology, and throughout the BRICS, we could bring it to countries like we have in Brazil. We've got all these favelas, you know, the slums around the cities.
Yeah.
We could build up public home building companies here. And the thing is, it's all self-financing, because people who move into this much better accommodation, they pay rent, and it pays off the loans that you need to build these things. Very, very, you know, it's a very secure form of financing. And we could house the billions of people in the world who are living in slums. You know, they need decent housing. And China's developing a lot of construction technology now, where they can build houses in a week or even a few days, you know, good houses, you know, that are good size.
But then how do you respond? Let's get into this question because we still have time on on this part 4.
Right.
So how do you respond then to the criticisms that China is a rival capitalist, and that it's a rival, and that's a rival capitalist / imperialist in Africa? I don't, and that's some Chinese business at such and such is committing human rights abuses to its African workers. So how do you respond to that criticism before I ask a follow-up question?
Sure. Well, the first question you should do is ask the Africans. Yeah. You know, I mean, I find it incredible that socialists in Europe and America should be making these criticisms and not asking the Africans what they think about it, right? I mean, ridiculous. It's ludicrous. But if you look at that conference that was held a few weeks ago in Beijing, where all the leaders of Africa came, and the enthusiasm that existed there, and I mean, you know, even Ruto from Kenya, you know, and you could make criticisms about him, but he said it. He just said, look, this is beyond friendship what the Chinese are doing for Africa. It's solidarity, it's brotherhood. We're a family, right? And China's not trying to say, China's not approaching this like the West does. Oh, we've got to give charity to those poor Africans, right? China's not doing that. They're not saying this is not charity. This is a win-win relationship where we gain and you gain, and that's how it should be. It's a constructive relationship.
And explain to the audience how China is not doing color revolutions, how China has not overthrown such and such.
Yeah, you asked the question. You asked the question. If China was being imperialist, there would be resistance. In the whole history of imperialism, there's resistance from the people who are being colonized, right? Because you're ripping them off, you're exploiting them and their raw materials, and you're shortchanging them on everything, and you're interfering with their internal governments to stop new rulers coming to power is going to resist that. Well, where's China doing that? There's nobody can point to any government that China's helped to overthrow. China's not interfering. Some people criticize that China should be interfering more. Some people say that.
In fact, China, there are even voices in China. I know. You know, my dear friend Fiona told me that the Chinese Youth Communist Party League, or however they're called,
right,
actually would like China to be more muscular in its foreign policy, so that when the West is trying to overthrow the Assad government, the sovereign Assad government in Syria, they would actually like that China, alongside Russia, pushes back against Western imperialism, which I find quite interesting in and of itself.
Yeah.
And of course, you can make the criticism that China should be much more harsh towards Israel. That China should do a whole BDS on Israel. But the fact of the matter is, no, China does not interfere in governments the way Canada, the British, the Australians, the French, the Germans, the Italians, and the Americans do.
Well, in fact, it's interesting you mention about Israel, because there is an example where China has a long-term strategy and you can pick this up from their global security initiative. You know, China's got these global development initiative, global security initiative, global civilization initiative, in addition to the Belt and Road initiative. And the security initiative specifically states that what they're trying to do, and it's a long-term strategy, is to trying to gather the international community, and I use that in a proper sense, not the way it's used as to describe the Western countries. They're trying to get all the countries around, a majority of countries around the world, to agree to hold an international conference, which will work out how a two-state solution could be achieved. And interestingly, there was a conference held some months back, quite early on in this problem with Gaza. The Arab countries met with the Islamic countries, and they had a conference where they agreed China's strategy. And in fact, they tightened it up. They also said, we not only do we want to work out what a model for two-state solution should be, we want to put timetable on it, deadlines. And what their idea is that they will get to a certain stage where they can then impose sanctions. Well, they will put demands on Israel to do these things. And if Israel doesn't respond, they will start to push for, in all international institutions, for sanctions, you know, BDS kind of sanctions, right?
Yeah.
And
although the two-state solution is dead, and I think China and the BRICS and the global community should be demanding a democratic, secular, one-state solution.
Well, that's another question, right? It's in the whole discussion. I'm not sure. I think again, you have to take into account what the Palestinians want.
Yeah.
So the Palestinians are pushing for a two-state solution. They don't want to live. They don't want to live. And I do understand. They don't want to live in a society with the Israelis because they know that it's not going to work, right?
Well, actually,
now in the long run, I agree with you. In the long run, that's what we want. But maybe as a stepping stone towards that, we might have to have a two-state solution, right? But I agree with you that
interesting.
Yeah.
But,
so
but also the PLO still the PLO/FATA still advocates for a two-state solution. Hamas actually does advocate for a two-state solution. Palestinian civil society, though, and what's been the Palestinian consensus internationally with the diaspora, is a democratic, secular, one-state solution.
Well,
going back to
no, but I think I did see an opinion poll that showed something like 80% of Palestinians actually support a two-state solution, not a one-state solution. You can understand why. You can understand why. If I was a Palestinian, would I at this point, given the reality, would I want to live in a state with Israelis? I don't know if I'd want to, because for the obvious realities. But it could change. You know, if you got a two-state solution, Israeli society further on down the line, because at the moment it's a nightmare, the Israeli society. There's huge support for fascism among a lot of the Israelis, and they want to kill the fucking Palestinians, a lot of them, things like that. That could change. And then, of course, then bringing them together. So, because obviously an ethno-state solution is not good either. Right.
Exactly.
So anyway, this is another whole debate.
But this goes back to why China is a constructive partner in the international community compared to the United States, France, Britain, all who have permanent veto powers in the United Nations. China, of course, has managed to get Saudi Arabia and Iran to have détente with one another, which is very good. We don't have too much time to get into.
Well, the last thing on that was, of course, that they got the different factions of the Palestinians together as well.
Yes.
You remember they met in Beijing and they agreed a statement, and so that's another important building block towards this solution, long-term solution that China is looking for. You know.
Yes, so I do wish when it comes to this idea that China is a rival imperialist, I'll just say that I would like the Chinese government to to not have relations with the Rwandans who keep invading my mother's country of Rwanda and stealing all of the minerals in the world.
Are you talking about Uganda? With Uganda? Are you talking about Uganda? No, Congo. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
The
Okay.
Banana Republic of Congo, not the Democratic Republic
Okay.
of Congo,
Right,
but
yeah.
yes, the DRC as it's called. But interesting enough, but there are African voices from communist parties, but even one Kambali Musavali, who I don't know if he still is part of Friends with Congo, but he's been on Breakthrough News. He spoke with Rania Khalek, and he was also on this new program that Breakthrough News has, which is Amanda Yee and KJ No, and he was on there to make the case that China is not a colonial reactionary force in African affairs like Belgium, Britain, the United States, Canada, and so forth.
Yeah.
But I think sort of in closing, you know, so this will be my second to last question, and then I'll get to my last question. Sort of my second to last question is, how do you respond to the criticisms that China is equally a climate criminal the way our Western governments and their corporations are?
Well, you could when we were talking earlier about how China swung the stick too far to the kind of unregulated capitalist development side.
Yeah.
And this is part of that because they allowed industry to spill all kind of toxic chemicals into the waterways, the land. There's a lot of toxic land in China that it's going to cost a lot of money to clean up, and they allowed them to pollute the atmosphere. It got to the point where in the cities, it got so bad that people had to wear masks and you couldn't see the sun and a lot of days and so on like that. So now I think again, China. Someone described China as a learning society, which I think is true. But China, they make mistakes and they're open about it. They have made a mistake. The President Xi says that regularly, which I think is to his credit. And they try to learn from these mistakes. And that's all part of the scientific socialist approach, right? So I think the fact that they have taken decisive action to clean up air pollution, the fact that they now, this year is the first year where coal is becoming a minority fuel for the economy. And the fact that they have expanded solar power, wind power to such an extent that they install more in China than the rest of the world put together, and they're rapidly moving in the direction, even with nuclear power, that they've made big advances to safe nuclear power. I think that this question of China being a negative force in terms of the climate, in the next few years, we won't hear this anymore.
Okay.
Because they more and more they will, and hydropower is a huge thing in China that they're developing. So I think that renewables
and the kind of scenes that we saw where there was so much, smog from.
It's gone. Yeah, it's gone.
Okay.
Yeah, it's gone.
Interesting. And then,
in fact, there's a lot of people in the environmental movement now who are big fans of China, because China is not just doing the things I mentioned about, but many other aspects of the environmental movement, like reforestation and many other things that they're doing, which the environmental movement likes.
Okay, then my actually, that's perfect segue to my final question. Actually,
right.
Because you mentioned that there are Chinese environmental groups that have been working to clean up the smog and all that. So my final question is this: So, does China have its own sort of environmentalist, eco-socialist movement? Does China also have its own movement that wants China to abolish nuclear weapons? And does China have also its own movement where Yeah, where they would like China to adopt a sort of a its own version of a Green New Deal. I'm curious about that because clearly, uh, within this, if you want to call it a one party state, within this one party state, there are different factions, and they do argue amongst themselves, but they all try to find a consensus, a critical consensus, into how to move forward with the day-to-day affairs, rather than what we have in the West, which it seems like endless bickering, and it's the worst kind of
Yeah,
bickering because it's amongst different factions of capitalists
yeah.
and reformists. So I'm curious your response.
Well, I think in a way what you're touching on is the whole question of democracy and participation and so on. And you know how you asked that question earlier about why the color revolutions were never got the traction. Well, if there had been a point at which people in China might have been sympathetic to that, that's gone, because Chinese people see they see the Western system, the so-called democratic system in the West, as a farce. It's a circus. I mean, how can you have a system where the people who are elected are so unpopular? I mean, they did a meme, didn't they, with that, the G7 summit, the last one in Italy. They had a meme of all the 7 leaders, and they put their personality ratings, popularity ratings beneath them. It's pathetic. It's like 20% or even crazy, So, and if you ask the average American or British person or French person, German person, do they think their country's going on the right track? It's such low figures.
Yeah.
People are so pessimistic, they're so unhappy discontented with their leaders. They elect the lead, and it's a game, isn't it? Of manipulation of public opinion, public relations, and they promise this or they don't do it. And so, of course, they see that in China. And not only that, they see the West attacking China so unfairly on one issue after another, and taking all these measures to surround China with rockets and whatever, warships and so on. So the Chinese used to, for example, America used to be very popular in China, but it's not anymore, understandably. But in terms of democracy, now Chinese society, you remember I said, right, I think it was in maybe the first session about that, the rise of, the revolution in China in 1949 and the institutions that came out of it reflected the brutality of a generation of civil war and battles with the terrible, vicious struggles with the Japanese and all the rest of it. And its institutions reflect, slowly but surely it's getting better, but they reflect some of this harshness and fear of there's a fear among the population of division and of which caused hundreds of millions of people to die in China. They don't want to go back to those days. So there's a natural inclination for people to want unity, and they don't want disorder. And this is also part of Chinese culture, Confucianism and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But I think I think, and of course now we've got an added thing to that, which is the hostility of the West, which is threatening war. I mean, I don't know if you saw this this document that's become out where they're planning for a war in 2027, the West. They're planning it all out, So you can understand the nervousness of Chinese people and of the authorities. They don't want division in their society with these threats. But I think what will happen will be if China and the BRICS, as it develops, right now we're at the most dangerous period because, and I use the simple analogy of that movie Ben-Hur. I don't know if you ever saw that movie Ben-Hur.
I haven't, but yes.
Okay, but there's a famous chariot race.
Yes.
And when one chariot is ahead and the other one's behind, it's not good. But the dangerous time comes is when when Ben-Hur, Charlton Heston, pulls up alongside and they're side by side, and that's when the baddie starts to use all these dirty tricks, right? That's the most dangerous time, when they're side by side, and that's where we are right now, where the Western neo-imperialists are side by side with a rising force in the developing world. which is led, is very much led by China, but it's not just China, it's all these countries. They're side by side. But I think what's going to happen is they will pull ahead. And they'll pull ahead to such an extent that the Western forces will become divided and demoralized and no longer be able to hold back the world. And when China gets more confident in its situation, doesn't feel threatened, people are feeling much more well off. I mean, the older generation were very worried in China to just eat, and they all know their parents, the things they went through. And now the younger people, they take a lot of this for granted, don't they? They think that, that everything is food and clothes and housing and so on, it's there. And that will become increasingly the case as China becomes a more modern. I think China's going to become like a space age society, right? Like something out of science fiction with the technology there. I don't know if you saw the drone display that they had a few days ago.
No, I haven't.
In Shenzhen, for the 75th anniversary now of China's PRC's foundation, and they had 10,000 drones, and they had them all coordinated, doing the most amazing shapes. I mean, it's incredible. You just wonder how the hell could it happen. So this is going to become increasingly the case in the future. And I think in that situation, people will feel more relaxed. And I think we'll tend to see a big development of participation, consultation. We already see some good measures of consultation in China that we don't have in the West. And I could give you some examples of that. And I think that I'm pushing for is that the public sector in China, it could become much more participatory, involve the customers, the workers, and other relevant parties involved in the running of these things, and it'd be much more efficient as well. And people would, because for example, if you look at corruption, you can have as many campaigns against corruption as you like, but if you don't give the power to the people to actually make the decisions and make things transparent, people who are affected by the decisions, you'll always have a resurgence of corruption. Where these party officials and rich people will try to bribe each other, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's built into the structure at the moment that you can have as many campaigns as you like, and that does help. But ultimately, you have to democratize these institutions, and not in the way of the West, which is not real democracy. It's a farce, right? but a real democracy where people who are affected by decisions have a chance to have a say in the making of those decisions. That's what we want, and not just in China, but throughout the world.
And I think 2 points as we wrap up is this: if we really want to solve the climate crisis, and no doubt we can make all sorts of criticisms that solar panels and wind turbines, that there's problems with those industries because it involves a lot of mining. And we can say that, the electric car is not our savior. But in order for us to actually really solve the climate crisis, is the American government and the West needs to work with China and the rest of the world constructively to actually get all of our scientists together to figure out how are we going to solve this crisis. And either it can be solved, or the conclusion, the scientific consensus that needs to come is, okay, we probably won't ever turn back the climate crisis, but we can give the Earths and the next generation a few lifespan by actually working with, by having all of our scientists work together to create, if it's even possible, the technology to give the Earth's lifespan. The pivot to Asia doesn't do that. The pivot to Asia is very counterproductive, and all it's going to do, as you say, is going to make the Chinese feel much more negatively about the West and them defending their government, especially when their government is being accused of all sorts of, nonsense and half-truths and so forth. And I think that's probably why, abolishing nuclear weapons is not high on the agenda of of whatever Chinese opposition. Not when the West is having all of their
exactly.
nuclear weapons exploited.
Mm.
So I'm curious your thoughts on that as we wrap up.
Well,
Oh, and also, and I'll just say,
yeah.
if I was a Chinese intellectual, or even if I was a Chinese student, and I, had the chance to go study in Australia or Canada and so forth, I would not be, saying to my fellow countrymen, "Oh, let's endorse, like let's have the American system or the British system with its unelected House of Lords, its unelected head of state, the Queen." I would not want that imposed on China. So I'm curious your response on that. And then the last word is, what can China actually learn from the West, and what can the West definitely learn from
China? Well, in terms of what China can learn from the West, I think, to be honest, that they have learned a lot from the West. I mean, in fact, the West complain, don't they, that they learned too much from them, right? But even like Marxism came from the West, didn't it? And although China has adapted it to its circumstances, I think you can't really accuse the Chinese of not being willing to take the best from the West. I think that they've shown that they can do that. In terms of American society and European society, I think that they are, sadly, they're going to have to go through a period of painful adjustment, where they're going to have to. It'd be a terrible psychological blow for them. For example, just on technology only, if they see China, and you know how these things work exponentially, one thing builds on another. It's not a linear development. So if China goes further and further ahead in terms of technology, which is what they seem to be doing in every field.
Yeah.
Who are in a bubble who try to deny that.
Yeah.
But as we see that happen, that would be a terrible psychological blow to the West, because they've got this idea, and it's a racial idea in many ways. I mean, it's not their fault. It's developed over 100 years that they are more superior in terms of intelligence and innovation and so on. And they choose to ignore their long history of China and all the inventions they made. But they will have to come to a realization that actually their system is not the best system, and that it's one among many, and that actually these other systems have got a lot to offer. And when they finally come to that realization, we might get to a society where they make the reforms they need to, because at the moment they're just going down the plug hole, the West, and it's just getting worse and worse, their situation for the ordinary people. I mean, the only danger you could say is that, will fascism come to power like we saw in the 1930s? Will that come to power in some of these countries? You never know. It's always a danger, because the discontent is growing.
Well, unfortunately, even putting aside, the neo-fascist movements that are propping up all over the West, it was Mr. Nobel Peace Prize winning liberal Obama that started the pivot to Asia.
Right.
Which
yeah.
And for me, it doesn't matter whether you have a Clinton in power or a Donald Trump in power. They both see China as a foe, and they both wish that they can make China either a state that they can just exploit to kingdom come, like the Philippines or Indonesia, or a self-governing colony like South Korea and Japan.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's what they want. But they're not going to be able to achieve this. I mean, there is always the danger of war, but I tend to, I think people raise this question very abstractly, because if you look at the experience of, in terms of nuclear war, if we look at the experience of the post-war period, the nuclear age, we didn't have, although, we did come close to it, but we never had a nuclear war, because the rulers of the different countries with nuclear weapons realized that it would lead to their destruction as well. And that was always and I think the same problem exists today, that although there might be a few crazies in the leadership of the military or the politics who would like to do that, like we saw, like that film Dr. Strangelove.
Exactly.
I just don't think. I think the vast majority, the mainstream of the ruling elites of these countries, would not want to destroy themselves. So therefore, I don't think a nuclear war is likely. It's always a possibility because of a mistake or something, but I don't think it's likely. I think what will happen is that the American empire is declining. It's in a fatal decline. You can't get out of it. And the other thing I'd like to stress is it's not China replacing America. That's a big mistake people make. China doesn't want to do that. China's not trying to achieve that. China wants to see a totally new world order based on international democracy, where the majority of countries make decisions and cooperate together. China doesn't want to become an imperial power.
Yeah,
if you look at,
And the last thing I'll say is that it is great that much of the Chinese diaspora is not taking shit from the West. It's been incredible since the pivot to Asia has gotten more and more lethal that a lot of the Chinese leftist expat communities, whether they're in the United States, whether they're in Canada, whether they're in Britain, have been taking the lead in saying that we are not going to be your model minority and be your useful idiots and having a war with China. They have deep links with a lot of family back in China who say to them why they're satisfied with their standard of living, what needs to be changed. And so I find that quite interesting. And it's been great to see organizations like the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, the Canadian Peace Congress, Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, Code Pink have been doing very good jobs in campaigning against the pivot to Asia, and one can only hope that more organizations follow their lead and not fall into the trap that we've been criticizing our fellow Western leftists of about China being a rival capitalist state, China being a rival imperialist state, which basically means like I may not like my Western governments and my capitalist governments, but if I have to choose between them and the Chinese, I'm going to go side with our Western imperialists, which is mind-baffling.
I mean, it's funny. Even I noticed some news today about Milei, in Argentina. He's having a big problem because the economy's in a mess. He's not getting the support, help from America that he's hoping for, because the Americans don't help anybody. Basically, all they do is they bring weapons. That's about it, right? They don't help you out. And he's having to go back, turn back towards China, because China's the only country who's actually willing to help.
He's not gonna dollarize the Argentinian peso.
It's not gonna work out. I don't think so.
But interesting, very interesting. Well, there's so much more we could talk about, but there's only so little time. I think this is a perfect place to close. So we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Pat Byrne, who's been a long time British and Irish trade union activist and a member of that of that noble movement, and also Pat, plug your book. When is your book on China going to be coming out?
Well, the plan is to publish in the new year, in January or February, around that time,
Okay.
That's our plan.
Oh, okay, of the incoming new year then. All right, fantastic. And what's the title of the book?
That's right.
Or no title yet?
Well, kind of. It was going to be Understanding Modern China, but I think I'm going to try and get a bit of a more pithy, more dynamic title than that. We have to make up my mind closer to the day. All
right. Well,
the other thing I'm involved in, the project I'm involved in is People's BRICS, and we're launching that. This is going to effectively be launching on YouTube later this week, and that's going to be what we're doing is we're linking up with radical trade unionists, community activists, political people on the left around the developing world, with the idea that basically to campaign for the BRICS that is now getting stronger and stronger, to implement things on behalf of working people, and implement good national policies to develop their economies and so on, and help them to do that.
Fantastic. And so folks, thank you for joining both me and Pat on this special 4-part episode of 1+1, where we look at Chinese history, but through a post-colonial Marxist perspective. And oh yes, and of course, folks, donate generously to 1+1. 1+1 does accept donations. And until then, keep safe, keep healthy, and whatever injustice you see, protest, power to the people, death to Western imperialism.